We read from Luke 8:40 to 56. So it was, when Jesus returned, that the multitude welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. And behold, there came a man named Jairus, and he was a ruler of the synagogue, and he fell down at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house. For he had an only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she was dying. But as he went, the multitude thronged him. Now a woman having a flow of blood for 12 years, who had spent all her livelihood on physicians and could not be healed by any, came from behind and touched the border of his garment, and immediately her flow of blood stopped. And Jesus said, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter and those who with him said, "Master, the multitude throng and press you, and you say, 'Who touched me?' But Jesus said, "Somebody touched me, for I perceive power going out from me." When the woman saw that she was not hidden, she came trembling, and falling down before him, she declared to him in the presence of all the people the reason she had touched him, and how she was healed immediately. And he said to her, "Daughter, be of good cheer, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, someone came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying to him, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher." But when Jesus heard it, he answered him, saying, "Do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be made well." When he came into the house, he permitted no one to go in except Peter, James, and John, and the father and mother of the girl. Now all wept and mourned for her, but he said, "Do not weep, she is not dead, but sleeping." And they ridiculed him, knowing that she was dead. But he put them all outside, took her by the hand, and called, saying, "Little girl, arise." And her spirit returned, and she arose immediately. And he commanded that she be given something to eat. And her parents were astonished, but he charged them to tell no one what had happened. I imagine that all of you have heard the saying, "Desperate times call for desperate measures." You know, apparently that comes from Hippocrates, the Greek physician, the famous Greek physician. You know, he who said that. Because, you know, sometimes you have to do things that you normally wouldn't. Normally you wouldn't cut off someone's leg. But if they had gangrene in that leg, then desperate times called for desperate measures. The people in our text were facing some desperate times. Did they need some desperate measures? What they really needed was Jesus' measures. Both these people, as I mentioned, were in desperate times. It's pretty easy to see why. This woman, she had had this flow of blood for 12 years. Weak, anemic. She had spent, not only was she having this problem, she'd spent all her livelihood. She was now broke. And the physicians had only made things worse for her. So we can see why it was pretty desperate times for her. But perhaps you didn't consider the social and spiritual aspects of this. Because of this flow of blood, she was considered Levitically unclean, which means for the last 12 years, she would not have been able to go to the temple to worship. Anyone who had known about this would have avoided touching her or being touched by her, because then they would have been considered unclean themselves and wouldn't, for a period, been able to go to the temple. So she wasn't able to worship, and she would have been shunned by society, and she's in pain, and she's broke. Pretty desperate. She also probably felt pretty hopeless and helpless and worthless. I think that's why we see her just try to touch the hem of Jesus' garment as he goes by. Instead of, coming in front of him, falling on her knees and saying, "Lord, help me." Why does she not do that? I think it's because she does not feel like she is worth Jesus' attention. She felt so ashamed, so worthless, that she doesn't even feel worthy to do that. She doesn't want to take up Jesus' time and attention. Jairus, too, was very desperate. That's pretty easy to see why. His child, his only child, this young girl is dying, and there's nothing he can do. But then he hears Jesus is in town. And he goes to him. He hurries. And though he's rich and powerful, he falls on the ground in front of Jesus, begging. My daughter is dying. Please come and touch her so that she will live instead of dying. So he's pretty desperate. And he wants Jesus to hurry because he knows his daughter doesn't have much time. Desperate times called for Jesus' measures. Is that why they turned to him, these two, this woman and Jairus? Because they had tried everything else and nothing was left? You know, we actually see in our text that's not the case. Jesus wasn't a last resort to them. It's just that they'd heard Jesus was there. And we read in our text how they both had faith. This woman had faith that if she just touched the hem of his garment, she would be healed. And Jairus had faith, confident, that if Jesus touched his daughter, that she wouldn't die. So we see both of these people had faith. It's not like they were like, well, we have nothing else to try. They were sure Jesus could do this. But there was also a problem, a big problem, with both of these people. And for the woman, it wasn't her flow of blood. And for Jairus, it wasn't that her daughter was dying. Their really desperate situation weren't those two things. As terrible as both those things are, they had something worse. And they required measures. Jesus' measures. What was worse for this woman than this flow of blood that caused all these problems, that caused her to be a social outcast and to be broke? What was worse? This spiritual belief in her that she wasn't worthy to come and ask Jesus something. That Jesus didn't want her attention. The shame that had been put on her, the shame that she felt herself, made it so that she thought she couldn't come before Jesus and ask him something. Jesus sees this is her real problem. And he takes desperate measures to correct it. Let me ask you, if you were really ashamed of something, would you want Jesus to call you out about it in front of a whole crowd? You're surrounded by a multitude, and Jesus forces you to talk about it in front of them all. Jesus calls this woman out. He said, "Who touched me?" He would not leave. And this woman feels compelled to fall on the ground and confess what she had done. I'm sure there was a bunch of people in the crowd when hearing about her problems. They shied away. Levitically unclean. I'm not going near you. How would you like to confess something in front of a whole multitude of people that's going to make them look at you like this? Why does Jesus do this? Why doesn't he just let her slip off into the crowd? He could have. He healed her flow of blood, but she had something worse. She did not believe that God wanted her or her attention, that she shouldn't come before him. And so Jesus does this because desperate times calls for desperate measures. He makes her confess her shame so that he, in front of that whole multitude, could what? Do this? That's not what Jesus did. He leans in. I imagine he touches her on the shoulder, although we're not told that. But we're told what he does say. "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Can you imagine what it would have been like for this woman who felt worthless and like an outcast? Who felt like she was not worthy of Jesus' attention? To have Jesus call her daughter? That must have been the most beautiful word she'd ever heard in her life. To know that Jesus, knowing completely about her shame, didn't care. That he loved her. That he wanted her to come to him and take his attention. That she, from then on, knowing that Jesus loved her and wanted her to come to him, could come and say, "Lord, I have sinned. And he wanted her to do that so he could tell her, your sin is forgiven. Go in peace. Any of you want to volunteer today to confess? Well, we don't have hundreds here. But confess about the people who are here your greatest shames. I didn't think so. Sometimes Jesus does stuff like that because desperate times call for desperate measures. Sometimes he will do things that cause us great agony, great shame, so that our issues can be exposed and the great physician can heal it, so that you know Jesus loves you despite what you did, that he forgives you. Jesus didn't just take desperate measures, however, with this woman with the flow of blood. Jairus also had something really bad going on. And I'm not talking about his daughter dying. Obviously, that is a terrible thing to watch your child die, to feel helpless and hopeless before it. But there was something worse. What? Jairus and all these people, they didn't think that Jesus could raise that daughter from the dead. Jairus believed that Jesus could prevent her from dying, but he didn't believe that Jesus could raise her from the dead. And Jesus saw, that's a problem. That's your real problem, Jairus. Now, you notice Jairus comes and begs, my daughter is dying. He wants to hurry because he's afraid of hearing that she's dead, and indeed he does. Before Jesus gets there, news comes that his daughter is dead. But there's this great multitude thronging around Jesus, and Jesus is being pushed. And so you can imagine Jairus chewing his fingernails. Come on, let's go. And yet Jesus is doing stuff and like talking to this woman. Come on, Jesus. Jesus surely knew what was going on. He could have hurried. Hey, a few weeks ago we heard how Jesus with the centurion healed his servant from a distance. Because Jesus doesn't actually need to be in the house to heal this woman. Why didn't Jesus, at the beach or wherever they were when Jairus found him, just heal her from there? Why doesn't he hurry? Because Jesus knew the real problem with Jairus was that he did not have faith that Jesus could raise the dead. And so Jesus deliberately doesn't hurry. Jesus doesn't heal that girl from where he was. Now, can you imagine the pain Jairus must have experienced when he heard, your daughter is dead? Don't bother the teacher anymore. That would have been awful. Jesus allowed that to happen because desperate times call for Jesus' measures. Jairus needed his faith corrected. Jesus could raise that daughter from the dead. And Jesus goes and shows Jairus and us that as easily as he healed the woman with the flow problem, so he could raise this girl from the dead. The whole crowd knew she was dead, and yet Jesus, with the word, raises her to life. And Jesus shows this not just to Jairus, but to us. What are your biggest problems? What are the most desperate things in your life? Many of you I know have diseases and problems going on. They are significant. Jairus and this woman had big earthly problems too. But they had worse things going on, and so do we. Our worst problems are sin and death. And Jesus is the answer, the measure for both of these. And he wanted Jairus and this woman and us to know that. That Jesus' life and death are the answer to our sin problem. That's why he was there. He had come to this earth to be the answer to that woman's sin problem and to Jairus' sin problem and to our sin problem. He would live his life and he would die on the cross to take away their sin. And he wanted Jairus and this woman and you to know that, so that we know his love for us. So yes, we are unworthy to come before him and ask for anything, and yet we know his love, and so we come and say, God, be merciful to me, a sinner, and know that he has been. But Jesus was also the answer to our death problem. His resurrection would bring the answer to that. His resurrection was from the dead was not just for him, but for you. So that we could know that Jesus is the answer to our death problem. Many of you have probably already stood by the deathbed of someone who you've loved. And someday, all of us, unless Jesus returns first, will be on our own deathbed. What are you going to believe in then? Think of when you're in that place, think of Jesus' words here to Jairus. He says, "Fear not." Has your spouse or a friend or relative ever said that to you? You're afraid of something and you're worrying, and they said, "Stop worrying," or "Stop being afraid." Did that help? Well, it could, if we follow Jesus' advice here. He didn't just tell us, don't be afraid. He told us what we should do. He told Jairus, don't be afraid, just believe in me. And that's what he wants you and me to do. He wants us to know for sure that as he raised that girl from the dead, so one day he will raise us from the dead. That girl was dead. The crowd knew it. Jesus knew it. Our text says her spirit had departed. And yet Jesus says she sleeps. Why? She wasn't in some sort of a coma. Her spirit had departed. But for the believer, that is sleep. Because her body would rest until God returned her spirit. Your body will rest in the ground, rest as ashes until God comes and restores it, and return your spirit to it. Do not be afraid, but believe. We might not like in our life when Jesus chastens us, corrects us, causes unpleasant things. I'm sure that woman didn't like being called out so that she confessed in front of all those people. We wouldn't like that either. Nor would we like it to hear news that a child had died. And yet God works in our lives, bringing pain, times like that, to correct our worst problems. Things we lack in our faith that prevents us from trusting in him, that prevents us from fearing not. Don't despise it when God brings those times about. See the end intended by God with both of these people. See how he loved this woman? He brought out her shame so that he could say, "Daughter, go in peace." He let Jairus hear his daughter was dead so that he could correct Jairus' faith to know that Jesus will raise the dead. And he wants the same for you. So that when he raises you, he can say to you, "Daughter, son, enter into the paradise prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Amen.